Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Therapist Connect podcast. My name is Dr. Peter Blundell, and I'm back this month interviewing therapists about their life and work. This month's guest is a long-term friend of mine, so I've known him for a very long time, Martin Fenerty. Martin is based in Liverpool and has been an accredited member of the ACP and been in practice since 2012, previously working in the NHS and charitable services. He's a person-centred counsellor, is also trained in CBT and EMDR, and has recently set up in private practice. We discuss all those topics in today's episode. If you'd like to support this podcast, please leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did recording it. So, Martin, welcome to the Therapist Connect podcast. It's lovely to have you on board.
Yeah, it's lovely to be here.
So I'm going to dive straight into the questions. And that's probably the best way to get to know you a little bit. And I know you, but for our listeners to get to know you a little bit better. So can you tell us a little bit about how you came to be a therapist then in the first place?
So all my working career, I've done helping work. It wasn't where I started. I actually studied biochemistry in university. I was meant to be a scientist, but I was hopeless.
That means you weren't meant to be a scientist.
That's where I was directed, shall we say, to be a scientist of some kind. And so that didn't go tremendously well. And so I had to rethink at the end of university really realistically what I was doing. So I started doing various bits of voluntary work, so with a local LGBT youth group and with the Citizens Advice Bureau, and that was probably the prime thing that got me into helping was that work with Citizens Advice Bureau, because at the time the training for volunteers was quite considerable and went into sort of models of helping. So that was an interesting introduction, and that was where I started from. And then things over the years moved in different directions, and eventually I became a therapist.
That's really interesting. So was the stuff around the Citizen Advice, was that like advocacy work then? And that type of support?
It was advocacy and advice work. So very directive, but very much focused on actually, let's compile all the options that there are for somebody and let them choose. It may be that they make the decision that you don't think is the wisest, but as long as they've got all the information, that's what you go with, and that's what you support them with as far as you can.
Yeah.
So it was good first principles around helping, around you have the resources and you offer them to the person, and they make of them what they will. And people, especially with advice work, they're asking essentially legal questions around benefits or housing or debt. The temptation is to be very directive, and you are to a certain extent, because you've got to be realistic, and people want that, but you're trying to hand people some power and some agency within that. And the advocacy is that basic principles of what does that person want to say or need to say, and you're presenting it. So yeah, many years of doing that as a volunteer, but also as a caseworker, so as a money advisor. And I guess part of what I experienced through that helping was a bit of frustration that I was doing lots of practical things, but with debt, people would come profoundly distressed because it's a very stressful experience, and people are overwhelmed with contact from creditors. And so often I found myself frustrated that I felt I couldn't really do enough for them emotionally. There's maybe actually quite a lot I could do for them practically, but the burden of being in debt and the circumstances that led up to that, whether it was job loss and just the profound changes in people's lives that can lead to that. That was probably the earliest point where I started having a yearning to support people emotionally and wanting to help them find the resources to have some resilience or some power in their situation.
Mm. Did you train as a therapist while you were still working at the Citizens Advice Bureau then?
No. So I did about 10 years in Systems Advice Bureau and eventually was managing a bureau. And I moved on from there because it was a very difficult role leading a very small charity because each bureau was an individual charity at that time. And my experience as Citizens Advice Bureau and my voluntary work in the LGBT and HIV community led me to getting a work in the NHS, getting a job in the NHS in a sexual health outreach service, which gradually transformed into an LGBT and sex worker support service. So my sort of career took me in that direction, and as well as doing health promotion, I was doing much more emotional support, particularly around sexuality and gender, and working with women who were working on the streets, street-based sex work. It was their experiences of sexual violence, physical violence, homelessness, abusive relationships. So during that time, I did a basic counselling course, did that basic 10-week
Mm.
course, and then it went from there. So I ended up doing my counselling training whilst in that service. And that's where I did my placement in work. So I was managing sort of dual relationships at the time as well. That's where my start in therapy began, which was working with people from the LGBTQ
Mhm.
community and women involved in sex work. So for a period, I worked in a local cancer charity called
Mhm.
Sunflowers. There was big cuts with this austerity in public health funding, which impacted drugs services and sexual health services. So my role in sexual health changed quite profoundly, and I went really behind the scenes rather than delivering services. So to keep up my practice, I ended up making links with that charity and worked there for a number of years. And then it's gone full circle. In the last couple of years, I've been working in Sahir House, a local LGBTQ and HIV charity. So I've come round. That's where I'm currently working employed and
Yeah,
just branching out into some private practice as well.
that's great. Well, maybe talk about your practice stuff a bit more in a moment. One of the things that struck me then when you were talking about mentioned austerity, and it just made me think about. So we're both in Liverpool, and it made
Mm,
me think about how many colleagues I've seen over the years who work in kind of the charitable sector, how much their career paths have changed or shifted, not necessarily based on where they wanted to go or what they were
mm,
planning to do, but based on funding and services closing down and money being shifted to other
yeah.
services and stuff like that, and how people end up maybe take unplanned routes
Mm.
because of that. Yeah.
That's probably reflected across the country, but I
Mm.
think Liverpool is one of those places where that's been quite acute. It's
Yeah,
recognised Liverpool has had some of the most significant cuts in local authority funding, and that has had an impact on the city. That has had
mm,
an impact on the picture of the support that's available to people overall.
definitely. How would you define your therapeutic approach, and has that changed over the time you've been qualified?
So fundamentally, I'm a person-centered therapist. That's what my training was. And really, that is where my heart lies. Subsequently, I have trained as a cognitive behavioral therapist as well. So I do provide some CBT and often integrate the two. But that person-centeredness really runs through my work, whatever I'm providing. In the context that I've worked, often people come to charitable services having tried NHS services and they just haven't fit. And sometimes they feel like from primary care just hasn't been the right fit for them. And I think it works well for lots of people, but maybe the restricted nature and the restricted model just doesn't fit for some people. They need to talk, they need the connection. And I wonder sometimes whether some of the principles of CBT are lost in that bigger picture. So I work I guess in a very person-centered way, if I am doing CBT, very much focusing on the relationship and the principle of collaboration and being led by clients and feeling the way through that process. So I don't know, some people would argue that I'm corrupting all the processes altogether, but I think I think it's a reasonable way to work. It's an ethical way to work. I guess that's made me become bolder in my person-centered approach. So sometimes people come maybe a bit skeptical about that previous experience of therapy. And so over time, I've I have become bolder in my person-centeredness. And I believe it is it's an active relationship. It's an active process. And I think there are more commonalities in lots of ways between person-centeredness and CBT than we articulate or have thought through. We just do them in different ways or maybe use different language.
I wondered, how do you see the wider therapy community and how connected you feel to other therapists?
I think I'm in an interesting place just branching out into private practice. I guess in terms of my connection, I'm conscious really in some ways of feeling quite isolated from other therapists. So I'm trying to reach out and make connections with other therapists. And it's not through lack of supervision support, but it's really from a desire to try and make connections with peers, just have that peer support, a bit like you do when you're working in an office, you have it automatically sitting next to you. And I think we need that peer connection just from a support point of view. The wider therapy community, I think overall in this country, we're still not terribly diverse. I think the stereotype of it being very white, middle class profession, and that's and dominated by women still stands. I think that's not the same as it was maybe 5, 10 years ago. But I think there's still work to do around diversity, and thankfully some of that is happening. But there's more work to be done with diversity, and that's not just around protected characteristics. I think some of that is around class as well. I think that therapy does work best when people have an opportunity often to have therapy from somebody who they recognize as having some sort of common experience or are able to project maybe having had some common experience with them. It gives them that confidence and that connection.
Mm. And I think about class, there's so many barriers for people entering into the profession in terms of costs and things like that,
Yeah.
which I think really can have an impact on the class base of the profession.
Yeah, and I think there's also, I guess from my own experience actually with therapy, I I came from a relatively middle class background, not hugely wealthy, but in comparison to most people in Liverpool, clearly middle class background. And some of the joy of my work, having worked in the charitable sector and with services that are targeting particular needs, is that in therapy, lots of my middle classness has been beaten out of me, for want of a better phrase. It's very easy to hide behind your polite middle classness and professionalism. And and that's actually not very congruent. It's really a nonsense. I've had clients call me out on my bullshit, certainly earlier in my career, or just be really puzzled about why I'm being the presence that maybe I'm being in the therapy room. And that's been a huge influence, I guess, on my practice around actually, I just need to be human. I just need to be me. And I need to shed some of my layers.
Mm.
And in terms of the wider therapy community, sometimes I'm frustrated in my interactions with some therapists where it feels like I'm up against a wall of therapy and therapy speak and a therapy attitude, and it's not necessarily very human, and it doesn't feel very connected. So I think there is something around. We really do need to keep doing the work around diversity because maybe there are shades of us still being a bit Freudian and being that frosty presence across the room or a bit removed from the rest of society. We need more involvement, actually, I think, and keep on trying to create that human element of therapy, just on the basis, actually, in principle, of making it accessible, of making it feel like it's something that people can access and you relate to.
What's the biggest challenge that the counselling and psychotherapy profession faces right now, in your opinion?
We're recording this after a couple of weeks of quite high profile media coverage, particularly in The Guardian, around regulation and a drive for regulation. And I think that's part of our biggest challenge, and along with the work around Scopehead and trying to articulate the commonalities of different therapy roles, and you gather together the different strands of training and making sense of that to other people and to ourselves. And I think that is the biggest challenge. And I'm torn in lots of ways. I think we probably do need some more regulation, and particularly some of the stories I've seen in the media of people working really quite unethically and actually not even necessarily even being trained as therapists. Actually, we would benefit maybe as a profession to having that protected status and the means to demonstrate that we're part of a protected profession. And the principles of actually trying to create a structure around careers and providing clarity to clients, to the public, to potential funders around what do all of these terms mean? What's the difference between a counsellor and a psychotherapist and a counselling psychologist? I don't think we actually even necessarily understand that ourselves. In the push for that, that's where I worry. I worry about who gets left behind, how they get left behind, and potentially how narrow the profession becomes. And I think that's really something that needs to be considered really carefully. And I don't think it's necessarily clear from the work that's happening in the profession about how that is being tended to and being considered. And there's a rush to professionalize without necessarily thinking, okay, you can define what professional is without losing actually some of the richness of that we have with the freedom of not being a regulated profession. And so that concerns me, and it concerns me about what talent and what perspectives we potentially lose from within the profession that actually help it grow and evolve and progress.
The idea of like a closed shop is coming up for me in terms of does it create this narrow idea of what it is that we do, and then we don't have any critique of that or openness to explore what it possibly could be.
Absolutely. And I think this is in parallel with the drive to create a research evidence base, a greater research evidence base around therapy, and that bias towards CBT from person-centeredness that is based around the lack of apparent evidence base. I'm glad that there's a push to look at person-centeredness in counselling and push resources to look at that evidence base to demonstrate its effectiveness. But with that closed shop, with that professionalism, maybe there's a danger that we become hyper focused then and completely restricted on what other people think is a credible evidence base. Yet therapy is a felt experience. It's a feeling, it's a feeling role, a feeling profession, it's a feeling process. And there's something around us actually capturing our experiences and articulating them and enabling clients to articulate their experiences, which is also part of that evidence base. Therapy isn't like medicine where you're providing a pill and there's some really easy empirical parameters you can put on that to determine its effectiveness or its acceptability. We don't have the benefit of that. We don't have the benefits of doing precise operations on the body. It's a much more creative process and collaborative process.
Can you actually measure every aspect of that?
You can't. And I think in my work in the charitable sector, we are in the HIV work, we're funded through public health, and naturally we have to report, and quite rightly report on our activity and our outcomes. But the challenge around that is actually if we do our measured outcomes, our core tens, sometimes people show no change.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes their core 10 scores are actually worse, but they feel better. And actually, it's because they can tolerate their distress more, and that's the strength that they have, or they have the courage to articulate it more clearly. And that's really hard to capture in measured outcomes. That's really hard to capture potentially in evidence-based research, and hard to articulate in terms of how important that is.
And even the idea of a core 10 measures how many things shift and change within a therapeutic relationship over the time. It's way more than 10.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So there is there's an ongoing dialogue, and I think maybe it'll be never ending in some ways around just fighting the corner that there is more to therapy than fundamental outcome measures and reduction of symptoms and resolution of depression or anxiety. We need very, in some ways, narrow parts of what people get out of therapy.
So, Martin, that's the end of my questions. I suppose my last one is, can you tell us about what your future plans are? What's next? I suppose setting up in private practice and focusing on that is one of the big things.
That's probably the biggest thing for me at the moment. It's very early days for me. So as well as working as a therapist, I've worked as a manager in the NHS for 20 years, and I've just finished working as an operational manager. It was time for me to end that phase of my career. So I'm in the very, very early days of private practice and building that private practice. And that's an interesting experience, exciting and frightening in equal measure often. So that's where I'm developing. I'm doing some work online and exploring that means to support my private practice, just in terms of my presence. So I've created a social media profile for my private practice, and I think I've been doing some videos on there, and they've often reflected things that just have cropped up in my own life or just issues that are around at a particular time, but talking about them in relation to therapy and people's felt experience, and maybe providing sort of information and education around it. I'm not a huge social media person. For all my talk of embracing tech, posting selfies and doing videos isn't my natural environment. So that's been really outside my comfort zone, and very much I'm learning as I go along. But I'm hoping that is another way for people to get a sense of who I am and how I might be if I'm working with them. So I'm reaching out to potential clients there for them to have a safe way of observing me without actually having to speak to me. And they might have the courage to speak to me then.
We've known each other for a long time, but we haven't seen each other for a while. So
Yeah.
when I saw your videos pop up, it was so nice. And I mean, you say it's outside your comfort zone, but I felt like they are a very authentic representation of you and what you're like. And you've done great on this podcast. Maybe you've got more skills there than you realize.
That's been very much my intention with those videos. So,
Yeah.
lots of stuff online is very performative. And I think, and my videos come with the rough edges of me. It's not necessarily that slick in comparison to other content on the internet, but that's very much my intention is I'm trying to present me unfiltered. So I'm glad that comes across. That's reflected in those videos. And I guess in terms of my private practice, I'm going to get around to training as a clinical supervisor. So I'm very much just a practitioner at the moment. But the supporting the student that we have on placement and my years as an operational manager, I guess a very different role, but my approach in terms of manager was very much based around trying to get people to reflect and support people in their work in a similar way to supervision in lots of ways. So I'm excited to hopefully start that training in the new year and offer that as an extra strand as well.
Fantastic. That's exciting.
Mm.
What we'll do is we'll make sure we put all your social media, websites, and stuff in the show notes so people can get in contact with you and follow you if they're interested. But Martin, thank you so much for being a guest on the Therapist Connect podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's been lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.